I'm Ray. I'm the head of marketing at Freshpaint. I'm joined by Dave, who runs demand gen on our team and works a lot with our agency partners. And today we're really happy to talk about the launch of the first privacy platform built for healthcare. Some of this may be new to folks on the call. Some of this may be kind of a refresh of some of the things that have gotten us here. But we promise today to talk a lot more about like the pathway forward and how a lot of organizations are adapting to these changes. So let's get into it, Dave. This is just to share that, this guidance and stuff that came down in December of last year, it's relatively new for traditional healthcare, but this has been something that we've been building towards for the last 4 years. Very early on, a lot of our customers came to us that were in health tech, like Talkiatry and Modern Health and Two Chairs. And they came to us with the desire of being able to promote their services, but they were concerned about a lot of the tooling that they were using, and that fact that tooling was not HIPAA compliant and was collecting, PHI from their websites and products. So we built a lot of the things that we're going to talk about today years ago to make sure we can address those needs. Now, obviously, everyone knows this is no longer a health tech issue. This is something Dave and I talk to agencies, healthcare organizations, hospitals all over the country every day. Everyone is trying to navigate this now. The good news is like the stuff that Freshpaint has built has been battle tested in the market and has been in the hands of customers, like advertising and building experiences for their visitors for years now. Super quick, like I think we all know, like this journey has been going on for a while. It started back in June of 2022 and has migrated all the way to today, where FTC, HHS are weighing in. The AHA is filing lawsuit against, the government because they feel like they've overstepped things. The reality is, if these things even go to the courts, they're going to be tied up for quite a long time. And meanwhile, as marketers, we're faced with how do we deliver results and KPIs downstream and meet the privacy concerns that our legal and compliance counterparts have. And a lot of this discussion today is not going to be about regurgitating the problem over and over again. It's going to be talking about a way that you can actually like take care of privacy and deliver high performance marketing. This is not like a binary decision. And in fact, Dave and I just were at HCIC, and a lot of healthcare marketers were talking about this as a moment for their brand. Like trust in healthcare and trust with consumers is a lot more than regulators and a lot more than lawyers. That's really a lot of what brands are being built on. And so this is an opportunity to be a leader there. Can you do both? And if you can, is that something that is valuable to your brand and your consumers? And is that something you should be thinking about going forward? Dave, you've had this conversation a lot about like, hey, like I can't send, like if I send an IP address, it's a HIPAA violation. And that's not at all what the guidance said. Can you talk a little bit about what exactly, this is an area people say is not clear. And I agree that some of the guidance needs to be clarified, but I feel like talking, to hundreds of organizations, for us at least, it's pretty clear on like what the guidance intention was around a HIPAA violation as it relates to web trackers. What have you learned?
Yeah, so there's some things here that changed with the guidance, where the kind of the goalposts removed, and then there's some things that were consistent. So from what we've seen, like as always, a HIPAA violation happens when you have PHI that's shared to a non-HIPAA compliant destination. That's kind of stayed consistent. But the recipe for PHI has just shifted slightly, so, or at least the interpretation of PHI. So what we're seeing now is HIPAA violation happens anytime you have both a personal identifier collected, and that could be anything from name, address, email, kind of straightforward things we would all think of as personally identifiable information, but also things like IP address are personally identifiable. So IP address, Ray, as you mentioned, the clarification is it's personally identifiable information, PII, but it's not PHI by itself. Also in the personally identifiable information category would be things like device ID or ad click ID, or even small zip codes. There's a list of 18 things that are called out. And when one of those is combined with health information, that's where an issue comes in. And health information, the common interpretation used to be it was whatever my doctor had in my chart or whatever I saw when I logged into my patient portal post login. But the guidance opened up this whole kind of pre-authenticated, pre-login universe of health information that includes anytime I visit a condition-specific page. So if I go to my medical provider's site and look at their page on diabetes or blood pressure, or look up a doctor that treats those conditions specifically, or when I book an appointment for medical care, those now all qualify as health information, whereas they were previously interpreted as an quote unquote an anonymous web visit. And so when you have both of those things together and you need both of them, that constitutes PHI. And when it lands at the provider doesn't have that's when a violation happens.
Yeah, and to put it in a way that like makes it really clear, because I think sometimes this stuff is hard to conceptualize. If you are a mother and you visit a website page that's related to pregnancy services, and you share data to a downstream tool like Google Analytics, where, as Dave mentioned, the legal framework, the business associate agreement isn't in place. That means that it's not okay to send data there. As simple as sending the URL pregnancy services, this is the health information, this is the context about the visit, and the IP address, which you can use to reverse to identify who the visitor was. This is the combination of PHI that we're talking about. If you just had one of these strings, if it was just the pregnancy services page with no identifier, or there was no context about the visit and it was just an IP address, this is not PHI. And this is something that is being misconstrued and quite confusing for people. Because imagine if it was just one, yeah, you'd be toast. Like there's no path forward. Like you would basically need to stop like putting anything on your website. You can't promote your services. You can't improve experiences. You can't do anything. And that's not what HHS intended here. Like, and I'm sure they will clarify this eventually, but like their intention wasn't to shut down healthcare. It was to protect consumer privacy and leave the door open for how we can continue to do both at the same time. And the reason that it's really hard now is because a lot of the tools that we're relying on to not just like acquire scheduled appointments and patients, but things we use to measure and improve the experience, things we use to like create better context, like even embedded video, like about your next procedure or about some condition so you can get richer information. These things all rely on these web trackers that HHS is calling out as being problematic. And all these tools downstream, none of them sign business associate agreements. And if you're waiting for them to sign business associate agreement, you're probably no longer a marketer in healthcare because it's most likely never going to happen. And so what are those tools? It really is the ad ecosystem and then some of the tools that drive experience. So any of the ad platform you're using, they rely on web trackers and data to make them work and to optimize their functionality. All that information that you get to build beautiful dashboards in your analytics tools, that comes from web trackers collecting things on your website to see what visitors are doing. And then video tools, that's become something that's a conversation point for a lot of the folks we met at HCIC last week brought up video, because if Google Analytics is a concern, video is the same context. It's sending identifier and health information in the context of that video, and it doesn't sign a BAA. So these are all things that you should have on your radar as tools that you want to use, but you're going to need to think about how you're going to make sure they don't get PHI in the future. So all of this, like, what's been interesting for Dave and I and for our team is that this kind of started out as a Google Analytics problem. Like, we're in the dark, we need to do something about analytics. And what we've learned over the last, it's been 11 months now since we've had the first conversation with traditional healthcare about this problem. It's way more than an analytics problem. This requires a process. It's more than just even tooling. Like, I wish I could tell you like Freshpaint's healthcare privacy platform is going to solve all of your problems. It can help you, build on top of the process, but you're going to have a process in place that is going to involve multiple stakeholders, new ways of doing things. And then you're going to need to find the right tools that are going to match to that process. And this is a rough sketch of what that process looks like, right? Because you're going to need to do some kind of audit to understand what is even going on your website today. Like, what is the universe of trackers across your sites that you currently have installed? And just because you have a tracker doesn't even mean it's a problem. Maybe that tracker is not even sharing PHI because it's on pages where there's no health information. And then even after that, if it's sharing PHI, maybe you have a BAA. Like maybe that tracker is feeding a CRM tool or an engagement tool where you've put a BAA in place, which now you've made it okay to share the data downstream. But ultimately, we'll get to this in a minute, you're going to get to two types of tools where you either have a BAA or you should get one, or tools where you're sharing PHI and you just can't get a BAA. And that's going to get you to the need to govern data. Like, how do you just make sure that those tools get the data they need to function, but never share them the PHI equation, which is what's going to get you in trouble with regulators or potentially class action lawsuits. The last piece is we've got a bunch of customers who've gotten to a clean slate, but they work with agency partners. There are other folks who have access to the website. And for all the marketers that are on this call, like unfortunately for you, you own the website. So you kind of probably inherited this problem of keeping on top of this. You're going to need some way to keep on top of when new trackers are installed on your site, because we're seeing clients who are having new trackers installed on a weekly or monthly basis. And you want to monitor for those things so that you can repeat this process. Again, are they okay to be there? Do they have a BAA? You're going to repeat this process over and over again every time you find a new tracker. So a big part of this is going to be process. You're going to need to build relationships with the legal and compliance stakeholders. IT is going to be a factor here because they're probably going to help you to analyze and verify some of these things about the data that's being shared. And obviously, your marketing leadership, you're going to need to have their buy-in of rebuilding this process with this privacy first approach here. And so just talking through some of the problems, like the first one is the audit, right? Like, you need a catalog of every single tracker on your site. And there's a lot of ways to do this. You can hire third parties. You can have your own internal team do this. But what you want really is as much context as you can get about all the trackers that are there. What pages are they on? Doing a risk assessment. Are these trackers risky or not? And you need to start with that universe. Like, if you haven't done that today, and many people have, if you haven't done that today, that is definitely a starting point. And then you're going to need to partner with legal and compliance to talk about some of these tools and how they work and make decisions about if that's safe or not. On the analyze side, this is where IT is going to be a big factor if you're doing it internally. If you've hired some kind of external agency, they can help you here, but you're going to want to analyze these trackers to see what data. One way to do it is what pages are they on? Like, I think there's health information on this page. There's PHI on this page. Then you might want to dive deeper to see what actual data is being shared and collected by that tracker, because if it contains PHI and there's no BAA downstream, there's no legal framework in place, you're going to run into some potential difficulties there. And then you're going to get to a place where you have two buckets of tools where we talked about. Tools where you really have to get a BAA, and hopefully you already have one. And then tools where you're not going to be able to get a BAA. Dave, I know, like, you and I have been on calls where on the left side of the house here with the tools where you need to get a BAA, people have asked us, how can Freshpaint help like govern data there? Can you talk about like why that's not even an option for something like a CRM?
Yeah, absolutely. So when you think about the function of why you have a CRM, it's beyond just having like a repository of customers. You have a CRM so that you can execute really precision marketing. You want to be able to send people an email based off of their activity. kind of a very basic standard function that we as marketers have all done. Well, that activity, if you're a medical provider, is going to include some health information. So if you want to send, John Smith an appointment reminder, you need to know John's personally identifiable information, his email, and then you need to know his health context. So he's meeting with, Dr. Smith at 3:00. So you need to have those both sides of that equation in-house for them to even function beyond anything other than just a list of contact information that becomes unusable. So when you're looking at some tools like an email tool, like a CRM tool, that require both sides of that equation that we looked at earlier to be able to perform their functions, that's where you would need to have a BAA in place to be able to use those really at any level.
Yeah. The simple way to think about it is the tools on the left require PHI to work, like CRMs, session replay tools, data warehouses about like the source of truth, all the data is there. So if you're using HubSpot and you're looking for some platform that can make HubSpot HIPAA compliant, you're not going to get there. You're going to need to, unfortunately, replace your CRM with a CRM that actually is HIPAA compliant. On the other side, these are all tools that actually, this is where the door is open. They actually don't need PHI to operate. They need certain data points, but they never need the combination of both health information and identifiers for them to function. And that's where you get into this world of, we now have like a fork in the road. So you need some way to safely collect all the data from your website that isn't these web trackers that are problematic. And then you're going to need a way to get the data to tools where you actually have a BAA and you can send more of the payload. But then you're going to need a governance layer. You're going to need some way to make sure that after you've safely collected it, you don't inadvertently share a bunch of PHI with your ad tools, your analytics tools. That's going to get you in trouble with the regulators potentially. And then we mentioned before, like, this slide is like the perfect state. You're at a clean place because you've gone through this process, but it's not a set it, forget it. It's not like a moment frozen in time, because the next day someone may, install a new web tracker or some new tool. Maybe you decided that you're going to start doing an investment in programmatic advertising and someone installs like the Trade Desk or StackAdapt, and that's not something you were doing before. And then now that tracker is potentially putting you at risk because it's collecting a bunch of PHI and sharing it downstream. So there's going to be a need to stay on top of this stuff so that when new web trackers are installed, you're ahead of that. You're not caught by surprise, 3 months later that things were hanging on your site that you weren't aware of. So this is where we get into like, you're going to need a platform to support this process. And, when we're recovering, we like to say we're a recovering CDP. We started as a customer data platform, and we learned, along this journey that customer data platform is really great for like high growth industries that don't have to worry about being regulated, because it makes it really easy to capture all this data from your website and product and send all of it downstream to any tool, like with the click of a button. The problem is that that's actually the issue that we're dealing with right now. It's too easy to go collect data from the website and get the data to Google Ads or Facebook ads or some other tool. And that's exactly what's tripping us up. So we realized, like working with hundreds of customers, that we needed to take a completely different approach, and that the market needed a privacy platform that was specifically built for a heavily regulated industry like healthcare. And so, and to match that journey of the privacy first approach, we wanted to build things that took you all the way from having a sense of what was on your website, like what trackers are currently installed. So with Freshpaint, we can scan all of your sites, and we can give you a complete list of all of the web trackers that are discovered. And then in addition to that, a risk assessment. So for many of the web trackers, we can provide a risk assessment. Very high risk because we know this tool shares PHI and won't sign a BAA, or low risk where that it doesn't typically share PHI for it to work. And then additional context, where is that tracker installed? So for each tracker, you could deep dive and see all the pages that it's installed on. For some of our clients, they found that Google Analytics is installed across 100 pages that all contain the possibility of sharing PHI. So that becomes like an obvious thing to want to remedy right away, but you need that data set to be able to figure out like what your actions are. Dave, can you talk a little bit about like what we've learned? Because I know people have approached this like maybe we can just use the trackers and we can hire some engineers to try to like filter the data out and make sure that data isn't getting downstream. Like, what's the starting point that most people generally agree on when it comes to like, you know, removing these web trackers?
Yeah, so it's been interesting to see the kind of different approaches and where people are when they come into Freshpaint, because we're still seeing a spectrum of people that have said, well, I removed everything and I'm operating in the dark. We had one health system we met with that said, I spent 7 years building a culture of data and it's up in flames overnight, and it's expletive deleted chaos right
I was going
now.
to say, I think his language was a lot stronger than that, but thank you for making it PG-13.
And so that's one. And then we're also seeing some people that are still running everything, trying and say, well, we'll figure it out. And then, but most people are kind of in the middle of, well, I've removed Facebook, the metapixel, but I still am running GA4, or I still have some things here. And I'm trying some things like, server-side tagging, some things to try and filter out the data. But a lot of those are either reduce the functionality in your end tools or eliminate them completely, or are very resource intensive. So Freshpaint tries to thread that needle, where what we do is we come in and we replace just the tracking component of those third-party tools. And so you would put Freshpaint tracking code on your site. You would remove the tracking code from Google Analytics, from Google Ads, from Facebook, from YouTube, from other third parties. And rather than trying to figure out kind of tracker by tracker, how does this work, kind of after you've gone through that verification process, we would be that one engine that would be collecting data and then providing that governance before sending it out to all of those destinations that you're currently working with. So it reduces the need for engineers to go in and filter out that data as you're working kind of event by event, while still being able to provide some level of information to the tools. And as Ray mentioned earlier, each of these tools needs some data, but not necessarily PHI to be able to function.
Yeah, I want to pause there for a second, because I would say 1 in 4 conversations, there's confusion here of like there's a belief that these trackers, let's call them out, like Google Ads tracking, Metapixel tracking for Google Analytics, Microsoft advertising, that in this new world that they still exist. Like, let's be clear, like the first starting point is completely removing all of those native web trackers that HHS has called out that have been tripping people up, removing them from your website and replacing them with Freshpaint. This does 2 things. We'll get into this part in a minute. As Dave called out, it makes it a lot easier for you to control what data gets to these tools where you don't have BAAs. But even beyond that, like, think about how this started. The markup basically did an audit of 100 healthcare websites, and they outed 30 of them in a journalist piece that were sharing, data with the Metapixel. The longer you have the web trackers on your website, the more you're keeping yourself open to people digging deeper. And that might not be FTC, that might not be HHS. It might be a lawyer, it might be a class action lawsuit. So we see these trackers as literal signposts to invite people to dig deeper. And the benefit here is they're gone. So if someone does an audit of your website, they don't see any of these trackers anymore. They see Freshpaint, and you can substantiate using Freshpaint because you'll have a BAA with us, and you'll have the legal framework in place. But before we jump into kind of how this works by design, I want to make something else very clear too, which is, and Dave called this out, what we're trying to do is, how do you go from like either being lights out or deciding that you have to remove these web trackers to, and let's be realistic, you may have to give up a few things, like very narrow geolocation may not be okay because that could be a HIPAA identifier. but let's call it getting you back to 95% of where you were before this conversation started. One of those ways we make that easy to happen is that we can take your existing Google Tag Manager infrastructure and we can migrate it over to tags that point to Freshpaint instead of to downstream tools. The benefit there is that your ease of implementation and time of implementation is very fast because you don't have to rebuild the entire event structure. Now, if you decide, your legal team decides, like, we just want to be done with anything with, Google on the front as far as like managing events, we have our own event structure in Freshpaint and we can rebuild that. But many of our clients recognize that as long as the tags are pointing to Freshpaint, where we can layer that governance and not directly to the downstream tools, that it's okay to continue to use Google Tag Manager because it's not sending data directly to Google or Facebook or any of these destinations. It would only be sending it to Freshpaint. So either way, the implementation is very easy. It's not like ripping and replacing and rebuilding your whole tech stack. It's just basically migrating events to go to Freshpaint as opposed to directly to these tools. Now, Dave called this out. This is actually the biggest learning that we had early on. We thought that signing a BAA made us HIPAA compliant. And I think there are a lot of solutions out there that are touting that hey, we can solve your problem, we'll sign a BAA. And that is an important step, right? We have to replace the native web trackers with Freshpaint. And in order for us to safely collect data, because we are going to collect PHI, we need to sign a BAA with you. And so for sure, that's table stakes. But like, you're not looking at a path forward to have somebody collect your data. You're looking, how can I keep using these tools downstream to drive high performance marketing? And those tools involve ad platforms and analytics tools that will never sign a BAA. And as Dave called out, I'll call it out. Like, if you go look at customer data platforms, CDPs, that may be a solution a lot of teams are looking at. The way that CDPs work is that when you connect that data set from the CDP to the downstream destination, by default, all the properties and metadata will travel with the event, like the scheduled appointment event, device ID, IP address, whatever else is in that data payload, that's going to go downstream. So for every event, you would have to go in and filter out and make sure none of that data is present, because if it is, you're getting yourself in trouble every time that event fires. And that's for every tool, that's for every event. All those tools, CDPs, were built for engineers. So if you're the lucky one that has a team of growth engineers, at your healthcare organization, it might be a viable solution for you. But most of the folks we're talking to, most of the marketing teams in healthcare do not have full-time growth engineers and don't have access to them on a regular basis, which is what it would take to stand them up. So what would it look like to make this self-serve, where marketing and legal and compliance can set this stuff up? That would start with, when you collect the data in Freshpaint and you connect it with a tool that's not HIPAA compliant, we just send nothing. So no data is going downstream, which means you can never accidentally share PHI. You'll actually have to opt in. You would have to go into a visual interface that's designed for people who are not engineers, and you would have to physically choose to send something like IP address to Google Analytics, or you'd have to physically choose to send a whole bunch of health context to a tool like Facebook. None of this stuff would be accidental, and none of the programming would have to happen by an engineer. It's all done through a visual interface within Freshpaint.
Yeah, I just wanted to add there too.
Yeah.
Like we've actually had, because I have so many conversations with healthcare marketers that have said, I'm a marketer, I'm not a compliance person. So a lot of us are coming up and learning these things in particular. So one of the things that we've seen with some of our customers is saying, hey, I'm going to actually invite the compliance person to have a login for Freshpaint. And rather than Dave, the marketer, who sort of mostly understands, I'm going to actually have, the compliance person on our team that is setting these allow lists for each of the destinations. So they're responsible for doing that. And then when I'm creating events as a marketer, Freshpaint's always referencing that allow list that was set by the compliance team.
Yeah, great call out, Dave. And if you don't mind, Dave, like, I just want to quickly go through 3 major use cases here, because I think it's worth seeing like how this works when it applies to the use case. Can you just take that paradigm that we've created on the safe by default and explain how that would work for Google Analytics?
Yeah, absolutely. So again, the starting point here is you've removed Google Analytics tracking code. You have Freshpaint tracking code that's collecting information about what's happening on your site. And for Google Analytics to function, they need to know what activities are happening on the site. So they need to know that, I, as a website user, came to the site, I looked at the homepage, I found a doctor, I booked an appointment for medical service, but they don't need to know that it was me, Dave, doing any of that. They just need to know that someone, an individual person, was collecting or was performing these actions on the site. So what we do here is you would come in and set Google Analytics up within Freshpaint, make that connection from the back end of our tool to your GA4 instance. You would set the events that you're going to send there, and then you would set the allow list that says, I'm going to send the information about the site visit to GA, meaning I'm going to send URLs, I'm going to send UTMs, I'm going to send scroll depth and time on page, but I'm not going to send anything that's person identifiable back to Dave. So no IP address, no device ID, no ad click IDs. And so this way, Google gets the information that they need to build charts and reports and graphs that probably contain some health information, but never along with anything that they can see as identifiable.
All right, Dave, I'm a marketer that's been using Google Analytics since it was created.
Yep.
And I don't, you've removed all the identifiers.
Yep.
I don't want a session-based tool. I want to see the whole journey of someone across multiple visits. Doesn't that go away now?
Yeah, so it would, except that what Freshpaint does is for every unique person that comes into a site being tracked by Freshpaint, we create a unique user ID. We then cryptographically hash that user ID and pass it along with that data to Google. So that cryptographic hashing, by the way, that complies with HIPAA's rules on safe harbor about how you de-identify. So it's beyond just standard encryption. It's something that's not reversible by Google to figure out what that unique ID is. But what that allows you to do is to continue to use Google's functionality that says, what's performance on new versus returning visitors? What does the path that people are taking from first visit to the site through to eventual conversion look like if they do that across 5 different visits on 3 different days? I don't know about you, Ray, but I'm someone that lives in 2023. I'm distracted, and I'll go look something up, and then my kid will ask me a question, and then I'll come back to it the next day. It's not all unique. One time I click on an ad, I come to a site and I book an appointment. So that ability to see the entire customer journey is critical. And so we provide a way to do.
You nailed it. You were sharing, because that's how consumers behave. For me as a marketer, an analytics tool is worthless if it's a session-based tool. And the other problem with CDPs is that they have no concept of this ability to de-identify the data out of the box. You would have to hire engineers. You would have to custom build it by destination. This is something when you hook up Freshpaint, this just works. You don't have to do anything. You don't need any additional resources to make this happen, which basically means you switch over to Freshpaint, and Freshpaint powers your Google Analytics instance versus the native web tracker. And you're pretty much back to getting all the reports that you had before, and you've fully mitigated the privacy concerns of your legal and compliance team. The Google conversation was coming up a lot very early on, and then suddenly we started hearing from legal and compliance teams who were like, well, if Google Analytics is a concern, why am I not concerned about something like video? And that's because if you are running embedded video players on your site and then hosting those videos on a platform like YouTube, you're doing the same thing. If anyone's ever uploaded a video to YouTube, as soon as you upload it, you get a transcript back, which means that Google has access to the context of that video. A lot of healthcare websites have videos that give context about upcoming procedures, deeper dives into health information. That's health information. And then when someone clicks on that video from your website to play it from your website, the IP address of that visitor is being shared. So this is the exact same context as Google Analytics. and it's an easy solve now in Freshpaint. This is part of our recent feature launch, is we'll basically by default make sure that that visitor IP address is not shared with YouTube. And therefore you can continue to host your videos, run the embedded player, and now you don't have to worry about the, the privacy concern of PHI being shared with those platforms.
And just an anecdote from last week in LA at the Healthcare Internet Conference, we talked with a healthcare provider that had actually gone through the pain to rip and replace GA4 and replace it with a different HIPAA compliant web analytics tool, thought that they had solved the problem. And then when we brought up video, they said we have over 1,000 embedded YouTube videos across our site. And so, yes, they solved the first problem, but now they're uncovering additional things that are coming up that are still causing compliance issues.
Yeah, and this is why we're recommending to think about this as a process, and then to think about like the tooling that you would need would be tooling that actually can help map to that process. If you're just solving for point solutions, you may be spending the next 2 years, point solution by point solution, trying to adapt to the continual requests and changes made by your legal and compliance team. So real quick on ad platforms, I hear a lot about like, well, we're in the dark, we can't measure conversions. I think that's part of it. But the bigger part that we don't talk about enough is that ad platforms in 2023 are incredibly intelligent. They require data to get what you want. And what you want is scheduled appointments, new members, new patients. Like that is the metric that you want that ad platform to like perform around. And in order for that to work, these ad platforms use machine learning to automate that targeting and automate like getting you more of those conversions you want at a certain cost. It only works if they have a data flow. Like they need to know that someone is converting and who is that someone. What they don't need to know is they don't need any health information or context about the visit. And that's the current problem, is that ad platforms are receiving all this PHI in order to make this like outcome that you want to be successful. But all you need to send to an ad platform is just a few data points. They need to know that a conversion happened. They just don't need to know what it was. Like, let's just say my goal is scheduled appointments and I want to fill my clinics with patients. That's all I care about. My entire marketing budget is going to drive that result. Facebook doesn't need to know that scheduled appointment was the conversion. They just need to know that a lead happened or something generic. But Facebook does need to know who actually converted, because they take that initial seed audience, the first 50 or more conversions, and they use that to enrich their targeting within their platform. So if you cut off that data flow, you're going to see your downstream KPIs like CAC go up 3 to 10x. Like it's going to be like, you're not going to be able to continue to like consistently advertise on these platforms without it. What they can't have is they can't have any context. They can't have any health information. Facebook and Google can't see what pages they visited. They can't see what buttons they click, because that could contain health information, which again is the recipe. So this requires you to dig in and have a conversation with your legal compliance team, because they may say, no, you can't share an identifier with an ad platform. That's not what the guidance said. The guidance said you can't send an identifier plus health information. And in this context, you're not sending any health information. Then, let's say we got to a clean state. These 3 use cases are really important to our organization. As I mentioned, like we're going to need a way to feel confident that the data is flowing from Freshpaint to the downstream destination in a way that doesn't share PHI. We call this new feature in our healthcare privacy platform event verification. As you can see on the left, this is the data set that Freshpaint collected. It has identifiers in it, IP address, device ID, and we're connecting this data flow to Google Analytics, for example. It's not okay to share those identifiers with Google Analytics. So when we build our allow list, we never opt in to select any of those things. And you can see in the after screen that none of those identifiers are shared. Now, you'll probably have a question like, well, I still see device ID. If you notice, there's a lock showing that it's encrypted. If you match those two together, on the right is not actually the device ID. That's that cryptographically hashed anonymous ID that Dave talked about that we'll use to tether together the sessions. So Google Analytics will know it's the same visitor. but they won't actually have the device ID, so they will not be able to reverse to the identity of the user. The value of this is that healthcare marketing, compliance, and legal teams can actually do this audit after everything is configured, and they can just verify that the events that are being fired are not sharing data that is unwanted downstream. And then you have the ability to continue to adjust your allow list and control for what data you're willing to share and not willing to share. And then, the last part that we talked about was, okay, you've gotten to a clean slate. You've built this new process. How do you stay on top of new web trackers that are installed? And so we have an alert system that will alert organizations when new web trackers are identified. And again, provide context, low risk, high risk, what pages is that tracker on? And then give you the ability to stay ahead of this and begin that process over again. This time it won't be for the entire universe. It will be for a few web trackers at a time. But then you would repeat that entire process to make sure that you verified if there's a BAA, is this safe or not? If it's not safe, can I govern that data in Freshpaint? If not, do I need to replace that with a tool that is HIPAA compliant or remove that tracker altogether? So hopefully that gives you a little bit of a lay of the land on the healthcare privacy platform, but more importantly on kind of the underlying process that we're seeing so many healthcare organizations start to prop up. And that's really informed our decision to build the healthcare privacy platform, is to support that process and support those motions that teams are putting in place. Now, there's a lot of nuance here. Dave and I have been at a lot of conferences. We've spent hours answering additional nuance questions that we probably won't have time to tackle today. So we're going to launch a quick poll. If you want to continue the conversation, we're happy to do that. We're happy to set up a follow-up call. We promise we'll act like subject matter experts and share what we know. We're not lawyers, so we can't tell you how your team can decide, but we can share how other teams are deciding. And then you can use that maybe to guide your discussions internally. I know we've had the Q&A open, Dave.
Yeah, so if you want to go ahead and drop a question in the Q&A, we do still have a few minutes. And we actually have appreciate the first question that came in here was going to be the one that we didn't get any questions that I was going to ask you, which is, if you're running as a healthcare provider, you're running a campaign, let's say on Facebook or on Google Ads, that is around some health related context, let's say a specific treatment for a specific condition, and you send back as a health provider, so someone clicks, and now we're going to send back that ad click ID with a generic conversion. Is that allowed? Because the ad click ID already was kind of tied to some health information, right? So can you kind of walk through that and what the guidelines say around that?
Yeah, I think this gets into healthcare providers who are covered entities under HIPAA. We're all responsible for the data, actions that are taken on our website. What data are we sharing back to these third-party tools that maybe are not HIPAA compliant? And that, if you're a covered entity, that's something that you're going to have to stay on top of. Now, today, this is a today snapshot, and I can't really even imagine a world where this would change. But a tool like Google Ads, for example, is not a covered entity. They do not have to follow any of the guidelines or guidance of HIPAA. And so if I'm a user and I do a Google search for diabetes type 2 treatment in my Google search box, and I get served an ad, that's health information, that's context about something I'm concerned on. But this is all happening, this applies to Facebook as well. This is all happening in the platform of an entity not covered by HIPAA. So in this context, it makes it okay to advertise in these platforms. It makes it okay for the user to click, the ad platform is generating the click ID. It makes it okay if you have a BA in place to collect some of this data. Where your responsibility starts now is after the visit to your website, what data are you going to share back? Because if you just share back a generic conversion happened with no health context, just don't call it diabetes type 2 scheduled appointment. That's health context. And you share back the AdClick ID, there's no health information being shared with that, so you don't have the recipe. And B, the AdClick ID originated in the platform of the entity not covered by HIPAA. So you're not even introducing anything new back in that context either. So that's why like many organizations that we work with, they're taking this approach because their internal conversations with legal and compliance have landed on this is a path forward. We've even met with some of the largest law firms in the country that have sub-practices in healthcare, who also believe that this is a pathway for you to continue to do advertising as long as you follow kind of that guidelines. I know there were a couple of questions about cost, so I'll just handle that right away. Our platform, we built this healthcare privacy platform. So if you're a Freshpaint customer, or you are working with your sales team on the what we call the enterprise tier, that's where we'll sign a custom BAA. That's where this healthcare privacy platform is included. All these features that we talked about today, these are included in the platform. So if you're using Freshpaint today and you want to enable web tracker monitoring or event verification, or you want to get new alerts, or you want to set up video, that's available to you. So if you're working with your CS lead or your account manager, make sure to make that request to them, because we can help you get that implemented and help stand those things up. But there will be no extra cost for you to use those things. We think that this platform needs to cover a lot of these use cases to make it very easy for you to continue to manage, privacy for your patients, and then also continue to like drive the high performance marketing that we know is like first and foremost in our goals. Well, I think we're at time, Dave, like right at 11. So again, big apologies from our side for the snafu in the beginning, but thank you for everyone for sticking around, and thanks for the engaging questions.
Yeah, and we'll send the recording out as soon as we have it processed here, and make sure we get it to anyone that missed. But again, appreciate the time.
Yeah, and if you have colleagues that had to bail while you were waiting for our technical difficulties, feel free to forward that recording to them as well. But have a wonderful week ahead. Thanks for joining.